Hello everyone and welcome to the third episode of ELS Discourse. I am Yashashvi Pandey, founding editor at ELS Review. With me is my colleague Sarthak Singhal, and we have today with us a very special guest, former Ambassador Menahem Chuck Kanafi. Ambassador Kanafi is a former career diplomat and advocate. He has served in Africa, Europe, Asia, and North America at senior levels, and has also served as a legal advisor in the Israeli Defense Forces and to various diplomatic negotiations during 30 years of civil service. During his posting at the Embassy of Israel in Germany, Mr. Kanafi served as the legal advisor of the Government of Israel delegation to the negotiations for the establishment of the Compensation Fund for Nazi-era forced and slave laborers, and was instrumental in achieving a €5 billion settlement for the survivors of Nazi atrocities and establishment of a future fund. Upon retirement in 2015, Ambassador Kanafi established a mediation practice and qualified for inclusion on the list of court-appointed mediators in Israel, and has since developed his practice as a third-party neutral in commercial matters. He currently acts as a neutral mediator for cross-border commercial disputes involving India, Israel, and the United States. Thank you for joining us today, sir. It is indeed an honor to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Ashwashi.
I'll start with the questions. You have represented Israel and Germany, Turkey, Ghana, and India, which are all very different nations with very different cultures, different societies. So, what are the challenges that you, as a diplomat, face when you're representing your country in such diverse polities and such diverse nations, especially when you're transferred every few years?
Many levels of challenges. I think I should start with the most basic level, which is adapting to a new culture that you in which you find yourself. The major task of a diplomat is to communicate. You communicate your country's policies. You communicate even on local negotiations for properties. You know, if the offices of the embassy and things like this, you must always communicate. And there are, in almost every country, cultural differences. Even if you're in a neighboring country where everything is very similar, there are differences. Different words have different meanings, and the first challenge is to basically keep your mouth shut, to listen and not to speak. As diplomats, we're trained to speak. We go through media training and press work and social media training and so forth, because we want to talk. We want to get our positions out there. We want to persuade, and really, you have to spend the first. No matter how much you study beforehand, you have to spend your first amount of time just keeping quiet and listening to people around you, from leaders of the country to leaders of business, to your own staff within the embassy or the consulate. That's of course the first level of challenge. The second level of challenge is, of course, then portraying and promoting your positions effectively. Because also it depends on certain countries read a lot. Certain countries look at newspapers mostly. Other countries, you find that a large portion of the population is even illiterate. And then you have to see how do you do that? Do you do that on radio? Do you do that on television, on social media? Countries where people don't have internet access, for example, then it's meaningless to put things on Twitter and Facebook, right? So it's finding the correct pathways to do it. And then, of course, there's questions of phrasing. How do you phrase things? And at a deeper level, sometimes you have to advocate positions which you don't agree with personally, and that's a major challenge. And finally, I think the last level of challenge is the family challenge. Most diplomats move with your entire family. When I moved to India, I moved with my wife, and my children were, I think, at about age 12 and 15 or something like that. And it's very difficult to move, as you say, every 2 or 3 years, taking them from one school to another, and trying to adapt there to, again, different cultures, different foods, different languages. And so forth. So I think that's how I would rank the differing challenges in moving around.
So in 2018, PMOA made the first ever visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Palestine. Interestingly, this entire trip was coordinated between Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. PM Modi also backed the idea of an independent Palestine state. How does the stance of India and the visit play in the relations of India and Israel?
Um, I think, first of all, the relationship between India and Israel are much more multifaceted than just one particular question. With any country, it's like that. I think for many years, up until 1993, up until the Oslo Accords, I would say that the relations between India and Israel, there were no diplomatic relations. Relations took place, at a consular level and just a trade mission level, sort of like that, were mostly concentrated on, yes, that one question. The official position of India was to support Palestinian independence, and Israel was rejectionist up until that point. From 1993 on, Israel also recognized, even if it wasn't in those particular words, but it intended to recognize a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine existing side by side in peace. That opened the door for diplomatic relations with India, and our embassy was established then. And beyond that, it's not a zero-sum game. If you support the Palestinian cause for statehood and so forth, it doesn't mean that you're anti-Israel. I myself, I'm Israeli. I was an Israeli diplomat and so forth, and I absolutely think that there should be a Palestinian state, within the 67 borders, and the sooner the better. So I think that was the big change. Was that in the 1990s, the change was from it being zero sum, either you're pro-Israel or you're pro-Palestine, to the possibility of supporting both. And I think that is in line, at least with the very official declared policies of the Israeli government. Whether the current administration supports the establishment of a Palestinian state or does not, that's open to debate. But certainly, I don't think that relations with another country could be judged on that scale. If you look back to a month ago, Israel established full diplomatic relations with UAE and with Bahrain, and if you follow the news there, the relations are immediately taking off. Flight lines have been direct flights have been opened up. Israeli companies are already opening up in UAE 1 month afterwards. And they're certainly backing the Palestinians and in favor of Palestinian independence and so forth. So that's become much less of an issue, and that's the recent approach. And PM Modi is existing in that ecospace, is existing in that international climate when one thing does not necessarily rule out the other. And so he can be welcomed in Israel, as he was, and he can be welcomed in Palestine. And I don't think it really affects the bilateral relations of either country with India.
So, in following with the previous question, India and Israeli relations have considerably improved in the last few years, especially since the current Modi government. So, do you attribute it to a few key personnel in the office? For example, Alon Ashpez is the current Director General of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, who served as an ambassador to India for 3 years at least. So do you attribute it to that, or there are other factors in play which has led to such improvement in relations?
I think the factors in play are much larger than any individuals. You're talking about two states with established bureaucracies, with foreign policies that you can point to. You can say this is our foreign policy, which bridges over administrations. There's no denying that there's, I think, great affinity between the two prime ministers at this time. I think Prime Minister Modi gets along with Benjamin Netanyahu very well, and vice versa. And if there were sometimes just for example, there was no real love lost between President Obama of the United States and Netanyahu. Everybody knows they didn't get along very well on a personal level, and so when there's a personal affinity, and something's going up, and one of them can pick up the phone and say, hey, this is going on, or I need you to do this, or could you help me at the UN with that, or something like this. Of course, that helps. But it's not the overriding thing. However, having said that, the appointment of somebody who clearly understands the importance of India-Israel relations, I don't think he was appointed in order to promote those relations. I think, but he's an individual who understands Israeli foreign policy and understands what the priorities are, and of course, in that sense, he was appointed. Ambassador Ushp is, I have to say this, I know him personally. We trained together many years ago even. He was, for most of his career, not all of his career, most of his career was posted to the United States, which is, let's say, the most important embassy for Israeli diplomats, and then spending most of his career there as a younger diplomat, and then going to India sort of reflects the importance there. It's somebody who could basically, having served in those places, pick anywhere in the world to go. And when he picked for his ambassadorial post to go to India, that definitely reflects his approach and his view of that importance. So, as I said, I think that's more a reflection of the Israeli approach to relations with India rather than a result or a cause of that.
So, in your opinion, how momentous is the normalization of relations between UAE and Israel, and which aspects of bilateral relations, according to you, such a relationship would strengthen?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, first, I think we should be aware that Israel has had a certain level of relations on and off with the Gulf states for years. We've had a mission in Oman. It's not open now. In Muscat, we had a mission in Doha, in Qatar, and even in UAE, we had an office to the UN International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. So the leadership of UAE in Abu Dhabi was willing to permit there to be an official Israeli representation with an Israeli flag on their territory. It wasn't an embassy to the UAE at that time, but it was there. Business, certainly. You couldn't maybe travel to the Gulf states with an Israeli passport, but a lot of Israelis had dual passports. And I think on an unofficial level, if you're talking about security services, contacts and things like that, then there was definitely cooperation because of the geopolitical situation in the Arabian Sea. So those relations were there really for years. So a lot of the critics of what happened, nobody is critical of establishing the relations with the UAE and with Bahrain, but there are critics of saying, well, they shouldn't have made such a big party about it because it was just putting an official stamp on what was there already beforehand. I like to tell the story also that I passed through Dubai in the airport a few years back on my way to India, actually, and the duty-free store in Dubai airport is full of Israeli wines. So in a country which supposedly has no relations with Israel and where alcohol is forbidden, it's it was pretty amusing to see that. But that's the sort of thing, is that these wines were available in the airport, other Israeli products as well. So that's a sign that the relations are there. However, it's the visibility element is definitely important. It sends a message all over. It sends, first of all, a message to the other side of what I said. The fact of you being, the fact that you're pro-Palestinian doesn't make you anti-Israeli. That sends the opposite message now. The fact that you have relations with Israel doesn't mean that you're abandoning Palestine. That's number one. Up until recently, Israel only had full diplomatic relations only with Jordan and Egypt. Out of the Arab League states, and now we see that's changing. That's changing as well. Again, because you support one doesn't mean that you reject the other. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, of course, is sort of unofficial or informal coalition against a common security threat, which is Iran. And we know that the Gulf states have their difficulties, their security difficulties with Iran, as does Israel. We don't have a common border. some of those states, at least a sea border, have, if not if not a land border. There's no denying that the United States is involved as well in trying to put together this kind of, as I said, loose organization. It's not, it's not an organization. It's not a bloc or something like that. But having a large bunch of like-minded states in contact and coordination with each other. And the final aspect, which is probably, at least for me, from where I'm sitting right now as well, the most important aspect, of course, are the economic relations. And they existed up to a certain point, but now they're really taking off. Dubai is a world financial center, a world business center. And, if you're not there, you're not anywhere, you don't exist. So the possibilities for Israeli firms to be working there, to be represented there, to have access again to this international financial community that's sitting there. Israeli firms and Israeli interests are present in New York on Wall Street, and are present in Singapore and in these world financial centers, Mumbai as well, and not in Dubai. I mean, come on. So that's it. And then maybe in the future we can see some issues of energy, but that's not sure. Israel is now developing its own natural gas resources. Of course, the Gulf is important in terms of gas and oil, and we don't know how necessarily that could play out. There is a possibility there. Just to go very shortly without going into it, Israel has a pipeline between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, which exists. What it can do is it can cut costs for energy, for gas and liquid gas and oil coming from the Gulf, and not having to go through the Suez Canal. They can dock at the Israeli port in the Red Sea. It's transported by pipeline to the Mediterranean and then to Europe, who is of course the major consumer of energy in the Eastern Hemisphere. So there's that as well, and I'm sure that definitely plays a role, as Israel being a transit country for energy. Israel's not a big consumer of energy, but that's a possibility, and it presents an actual tangible savings to sending a tanker through the Suez Canal. Some of the tankers are even too big; they have to go around. That's an issue as well.
A very normal question that generally comes up when we talk about the normalization of relations between Israel and UAE is how likely is Saudi Arabia to follow the same, and what are the general impediments for such a move?
First of all, I want to preface that by saying that in the Jewish tradition, in our writings, our scriptures, from 3,000, 4,000 years ago, it says that in the modern day now, that prophecy has only been given to children and idiots, and I'm not a child anymore, that's for sure, and I hope that I'm not an idiot, so I don't want to prophesy about relations with Saudi Arabia. Look, on the one hand, it's clear that for a country like UAE or Bahrain to enter into full diplomatic relations, they must have gotten the green light from Saudi Arabia. It's impossible that it didn't happen that way. Not only that, Saudi Arabia, up until last month, did not allow planes with Israeli registration or planes which were bound for Tel Aviv to land in, rather to cross through Saudi airspace. I'm sorry, that was about a year ago. Then Air India was permitted to fly across Saudi, but not El Al, not the Israeli airline. And now they're permitted. The ones flying to the Gulf, if it's El Al or Etihad or Emirates or whatever, are now permitted to fly through Saudi airspace. So if they're changing a position which they've held for 70 years, it's clear that there was an implicit thumbs up for that sort of thing. On the other hand, if you're talking about open diplomatic relations with Saudi as such, I'm not sure. As I said, I'm not a prophet. Saudi Arabia is still the steward of the Arab League peace plan. for the Middle East, which involves, establishment of a Palestinian state as a precondition. And I think that official Saudi Arabia may well continue with that sort of policy, while, as I said, permitting, even perhaps encouraging the countries around to be in good relations and to facilitate those where possible. Of course, I mean, I think the Israeli government would love to see Saudi Arabia as a full partner with an embassy, in Riyadh and so forth. Also, I mean, even for for religious purposes, for the Hajj, Israel has 15 to 20% Muslim population of Israeli citizens, and to just facilitate those people to go to Mecca is, just on that level already has pretty large economic implications for for Saudi and for us as well. So I don't think it's happening anytime soon, full relations, but in terms of quiet normalization, I think it's already underway. We can see that, and what exactly happens along the way in terms of business and so forth, as I said, remains to be seen. But I personally don't think that at this point full relations would be established. I'd be happy to be proven wrong, of course.
I have a follow-up to the question that I had just asked. So, is there a general hesitancy to publicly embrace Israeli and Muslim majority nations, or nations who have only recognized Palestine up till now? So, for example, leaders of those nations have actually met Israeli leaders, or have, in general, at some level, there is some interaction between those nations, but publicly they don't want to engage with Israel. So, for example, Benjamin Netanyahu visited Oman and visited Sultan Qaboos in 2018, I guess. And in 2016 in Bangladesh, there was a backlash against the opposition leader meeting an Israeli politician. The Bangladeshi Prime Minister called it an Mossad conspiracy or something like that. So do you think that the Muslim population still is kind of inclined only towards Palestine and is opposed to the existence of Israel?
I don't know. There are certain levels, of course. I mean, at one level, there's a level of opposition to Israel's existence at all, and some of them is opposition, perhaps, to Israel's conduct as vis-a-vis Palestine, the occupation of Palestine, not agreeing to independence and so forth, which is a kind of lighter level. It depends. It depends. First of all, this has to be said openly. It depends on the nature of the regime in the given state. In the street in Egypt, the street has been pretty much opposed to peace with Israel since 1979, since the peace treaty was signed. But there has been a distinct policy decision made by the leadership that peace is necessary for many reasons, for military reasons, for economic reasons, for geopolitical reasons, whatever. And that is that is governed. Egypt has, although there have been many crises since 1979. There was the Israel invasion of Lebanon in 1982, and then there was the first Intifada and second Intifada, and all of these conflict situations. And yet, the Egyptian government, including the short-lived Morsi government, had maintained and did not abrogate relations with Israel, in spite perhaps of what the street thinks. There are other countries where the street is not necessarily anti, and there are other countries. You take a country like Senegal, which is a Muslim majority country. It's not an Arab country, but it's a Muslim majority country, where the people tend to be very pro-Israel. So that's a possibility as well. Also, without being anti-Palestine. But you see, it's complicated. You see, now there's been discussion of Sudan, of the possibility of establishing relations with the Republic of Sudan, North Sudan. Israel's had relations with South Sudan since independence. And while there seems to be the government, which is now a transitional government as well, but the government seems to be negotiating some sort of recognition with Israel. They have not announced it and they have not implemented it because of, and this is the official claim that they're making, that the street wouldn't necessarily accept it. And the political situation there, the domestic situation, is delicate enough that they don't want to chance it. They don't want to chance the kind of unrest that they believe it may cause. This is a function of what the leadership of countries have been projecting also for since the establishment of Israel 70 odd years ago, 72 years ago. If they've been portraying Israel as this pariah state and kind of the small Satan, as Iran portrays it, with the U.S. being the big Satan. If they portray them this way for 70 years, it's very difficult. If that's being taught in schools, it's very difficult to get the street on your side. Then especially in a kind of in a democratic country where the people have some say. But even countries where it just might cause unrest. Israel has come closer and come farther from establishing relations with Muslim majority countries, with Arab countries over the years. There were, Israel had relationship with Mauritania, and then it was cut off, which is an Arab country. There have been better relations with North Africa, worse relations. I remember there were lots of contacts with Pakistan at the beginning of the millennium, in the early 2000s. If you're talking about probably 2003, 2004, everybody thought, well, there's going to be relations with Pakistan tomorrow, and it didn't happen. So these sort of things come and go in waves, and even when they happen, they're not necessarily permanent. So I don't think it's not a particular block, though, to having certain sorts of relationships with these countries. Again, mostly business. If you're talking about Malaysia, Indonesia, Gulf states, whatever, you're talking about mostly economic interests. If both sides want to do business, they're going to do business.
Do you think that the supposed Iranian military or strategic victories in Syria and Yemen have brought Israel and other Arab nations closer? Or is it the technological advances made by Israel and the commercial opportunities that it provides that have worked in Israel's favor?
I don't think it's binary. I don't think it's one or the other. You can't say, it's just because of military reasons or just because of economic reasons. Although, and actually both of those sorts of considerations are the kind of things that can take place under the table if you want them to also. Israel cooperated militarily with India before 1992. There was defense cooperation at that point. So Israel has had defense cooperation with other countries with which it doesn't have official relations. And the same goes for economic relations. I don't think any one thing is necessarily the motor which drives that sort of thing. It's a question of constellation. It's a question of what's going on at the time. It's certainly a question of what superpowers are trying to do or how they're involved, be it the Americans or the Russians or the Chinese, whatever. That always has an effect. Of what's going on. And sometimes there's a moment, and then when that opportunity is there, that opportunity needs to be grasped. Israel itself has said that they're open to relations, with any country that declares themselves open to it. Remains to be seen, but that's already there's already an open door there. But I think it has. If it were just military, or if it were just economic, that probably wouldn't be enough to do that. But when it's multifaceted and multi-layered, then yes.
So, what do you think is the impact of former senior military officials being part of foreign policy making initiatives? And do you think that it colors their perspectives on foreign policy initiatives, such as their inclination towards hard power initiatives? And I ask this question in the context of the current Foreign Minister, Gabriel Ashkenazi, who was formerly the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces. So does their previous job color their ability to function in the present job?
let me put it this way, and I can say this because I'm not an official representative of any government anymore at this point. In general, I'm opposed to generals being in positions of making policy outside of military things. I don't think necessarily generals, and we've had this in Israel and we're going to have it again, I don't think necessarily generals are by definition fit to be Minister of the Treasury or Minister of Transport or Minister of, or Prime Minister for that matter. You know, the fact that they've led the army doesn't make them naturally naturally fit to lead the country per se. Having said that, there have been a number of generals who have been ministers of foreign affairs of Israel over the course of the year, and it remains. I think it remains to be seen about the individual. If you want me to actually go into the the details of it, the rumors in Israel say that Ashkenazi is just planning to be Minister of Defense when his boss, when Benny Gantz rotates into the premiership in another year or so, so that he's just in foreign affairs, as a kind of passing through phase. There's that rumor anyway. I've met Mr. Minister Ashkenazi in the past when he was the head of the chief of staff, and I was a diplomat in one of my posts. He has, I think, he has a good grasp of foreign policy in all of its aspects, not just in terms of hard power, but he definitely understands the different levels there. So I think with this particular general, that's not so much of an issue. However, there have been other generals who it has been an issue with. I can say that. I can say that straight out. Yeah, again, to my mind, it would be better for generals just to stay away from politics. But that's there's a very old story. If I have a minute to tell this, that the Sixth Fleet, the American Mediterranean Fleet, traditionally docks once a year in Haifa port in Israel as a show of friendship and so forth, to give their soldiers, some rest and relaxation in Israel and so forth. And the American ambassador at the time, this was years ago, hosted a dinner for the admiral, of the fleet who came there. And after dinner, they're sitting around smoking the cigars and drinking the brandy or whatever. And the admiral says, I'm thinking of talking to President, I think it was Johnson at the time, President Johnson of the U.S. He said, I'm thinking of talking to President Johnson. I'm getting ready to retire, and I'd like him to give me an ambassadorial post, And the American ambassador responded. He said, well, I'm retiring soon too, and I was thinking of talking to Johnson to get a post as an admiral. And that's basically what I think about the involvement of ex-military officers in politics and in diplomacy. But again, having said that, there have been some success stories, and I think up until now, at least, Ashkenazi is doing a pretty good job of being Minister of Foreign Affairs.
So it was an honor to have you with us. I'm sure our viewers must have learned a lot through your insight. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks.